it's pretty disastrous socially because it sets up a dynamic of social fragmentation and competition, not just for material status. I mean, in litigation terms, it's not just the fact that people want money through going to court. It's kind of even more insidious than that. It's almost like, your whole existence is validated through the extent to which, victimhood has become the kind of currency, if you like, of social status and value.
Dr. Alka Sehgal Cuthbert is an educator, academic, author, and campaigner. She's the founder and director of the advocacy group Don't Divide Us, which promotes impartiality in education and open discussion in society. She regularly speaks at conferences and has given evidence to the All-Party Parliamentary Group Inquiry on knowledge and skills in education. She's a prolific author with books on what should schools teach and the dangers of the new anti-racism. And her latest report is The Equality Act Isn't Working. So, Dr. Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Why isn't the Equality Act working? What's the thrust of your report?
It prioritises the vulnerability, particularly of people according to their membership of minority groups, because the vulnerability inheres in the fact of being a minority, and therefore the majority inherently has something that is going to be a threat to the minority. So you need protections, and that is what the Equality Act embodies.
If I remember correctly,
Yeah.
and I have to say I haven't read the Equality Act 2010 for some time, then isn't that the act which brings in the whole concept of protected characteristics, and that there are certain groups of people who need particular protection, particular strengthening support from the law? What's your view of protected characteristics as a tool?
It's pretty disastrous socially because it sets up a dynamic of social fragmentation and competition, not just for material status. I mean, in litigation terms, it's not just the fact that people want money through going to court. It's kind of even more insidious than that. It's almost like, your whole existence is validated through the extent to which, victimhood has become the kind of currency, if you like, of social status and value, as opposed to other character dispositions that society would have valued in the past. And so this sets up quite a corrosive, it sets up a competition between different groups. And then on top of that, you have not all groups are valued equally, because cultural and political pressures flow into this. And some groups are clearly considered to be in need of more protection than other groups. So you then get a perception of, it's not just a perception, it is a reality of a kind of a two-tier application of a law that should be applied universally. And that's obviously going to create frustration and resentment. And you can just see the kind of negative social and cultural consequences of this sort of set of interrelated beliefs that is now kind of embodied and given legal substance through the Equality Act. Really, it's a tremendous source. It's not the only thing that's causing, I think, social division today, but it is a pretty major contributor, I think.
Bit of a paradox then, isn't it? Because you have something called the Equality Act, and then you find that what it actually does is almost the exact opposite by dividing society up. In fact, your organization, Don't Divide Us, has been set out for that reason, hasn't it? Is that how it came about and what its purpose is?
Yes, it was. I mean, it came about very spontaneously in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests after the George George Floyd's murder in 2020. And what was happening was that in response to an open letter in the Spectator, I think it was, which had an email address, many people were writing in, mostly at that time parents whose children were going back to school after lockdown. And all their lives they had kind of been working and being parents and telling their children that colour didn't really matter, that in terms of it shouldn't matter in terms of, it might matter in terms of your cultural, personal preferences, but in terms of who, how you judge a person, how you treat a person, it doesn't matter. It's what the person says and what the person does and how they conduct themselves, aka the Martin Luther King version of colorblind anti-racism. But I mean, it goes further back. It goes back to Aristotle, in fact, if you think of character and dispositions. And anyway, their children were coming back with homework, and that were asking them to, notice, analyze their family. Are you both your parents white? Do you have a different color? Is one parent a different color? How many friends who are non-white do you have? In other words, really pushing racial and skin color difference down the throats of young children. And I'm not a child, and I'm sort of very well educated, in terms of academic education. And even I now, you cannot avoid it. Right? I'm now more aware of my skin color than I have ever been in the kind of 60 odd years of my life in Britain. It's quite extraordinary. It's not to say that I feel that I'm not claiming that I'm suffering from racism, but what I'm saying is that race has become a much more salient category through which people, a prism through which people, are encouraged to see themselves and to see others, and then to attribute moral virtues or moral sins according to color, skin color. What is going on? Why is my child being told this? And what can I do about it? And the fact was that there was very little they could do about it, because even though schools are meant to be teaching impartially under, I think, sections 406 and 407 of the 1996 or 98 Education Act, they were, like a lot of things, they were just being ignored. It's just, that was not, the moral imperatives of social justice, of being anti-racist, were more important than a traditional observation and respect for quite an important stipulation in the Education Act. So that was what got me involved initially.
So what was your personal journey then from a teacher of literature, English literature, to director of Don't Divide Us? How'd you get there?
Well, I was doing my PhD part-time, and I was working as a supply teacher alongside doing that, partly for money, but also partly because it's very easy, especially if you do it like I did my PhD at Cambridge, to get quite removed from everyday reality. I mean, you need to be to do academic work, you need to be removed, but you do also need to, at some point, to have some kind of connection back with reality. And it can be done in different ways. But for me, just being in schools allowed me to actually, it was like an informal validation, if you like, of what I was looking at theoretically. And I could see how it was rolling out. And I was very shocked because, I had taken quite a long break after I had our children, from being a full-time teacher. And when I then returned to schools as a supply teacher, I was shocked. I could not believe what I was seeing in a very short space of time. This is not to do with social justice. This is to do with a kind of technicism and a micromanagerialism and a complete disregard for, disciplinary subjects and standards of truth, ethical practices of how adults should treat children, and specifically how adults who claim to be teachers should be treating children and behaving with their colleagues. I could just see an utter breakdown in all the norms that I had.
And was this in lots of schools? You said you were a supply teacher. Did you see this not just in one place, but in many?
Yes, it was in most of the schools that I worked in. I mean, I haven't worked across the nation, but
Mm.
I've got friends who are teachers in other places in the nation. I live in Norfolk and in Norfolk, so I was doing supply work within many different schools in Norfolk. And yes, it was, and it was not limited to just schools that Ofsted had deemed bad. This was in schools that were judged to be excellent by Ofsted as well. It may not have been quite so obvious, but there was the same. I don't know really how to describe it. I suppose one good example would be um, this was quite a good school. There were not many obvious, it wasn't like one of the worst behaviorally by any means that I've been to. And in the staff room, they had a big poster with all sort of a selection of photographs of pupils, and on it said, "These are the pupils who will get us our 90% or whatever of A stars." And oh, it wasn't 90, I don't know, whatever the figure was. And I looked at that and something seemed really wrong about it. And I sort of, there was another teacher there who was working there full time. And I said, "That's a bit odd." And she said, yes, yes, I know, really perhaps we were under ambitious. We should have said, we should have been going for, 95% of A stars. And I just thought, and then it clicked what was wrong with it. It's like
Yeah.
this school was treating pupils as a means for them to get their target. And that is not what I had thought schools were. Schools were there to serve the interests of education and society as a whole by teaching children the
But
subjects.
the difficulty here is, though, that those targets are set externally and imposed by Ofsted. And Ofsted, of course, is an agency of the government. So
Mm.
is Ofsted the problem here? Do you put it in their ball court, the problem? Um,
Well, I think they've certainly uh, I think they've expressed the problem. I mean, I don't know how far they've kind of exacerbated a problem that was probably emerging. I mean, when they were created after the Education Reform Act, it was a form of centralization. It was to give the government more direct control in schools.
yeah.
Um,
I mean,
and
before
they,
that,
they
we had the Majesty's Inspectorate, didn't we? And they were professionals.
We did, and I
100%.
think they still exist, but their role is very marginalized now.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you had a very different, to become an HMI, Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools, you would most of them would have worked their way through the ranks, as teachers, as heads of departments. So they had a very, a lot of experience as well as theoretical knowledge to draw upon. Um, Ofsted was an expanded administrative um, production organization, and was taking in people staffed by a new range of people, a different type of person, people who tended to be, have paper qualifications in all kinds of managerial administrative things. There were less subject experts. And you don't, to be an Ofsted inspector, you do not have to be an expert in the subject that you're examining, which is pretty weird.
Mm.
And my experience of both HMI and Ofsted inspectors, was very illustrative. I could see, you could tell the difference at once. The HMI inspector gave me really constructive criticism that I could use, really made sense in the context of the classroom and the pupils that the inspector had sat in on. The Ofsted inspector was just telling me something that came from a later sort of fad in the proliferating edu Twitter sphere landscape, um, and took no cognizance at all of the fact that it was a literature lesson, not a language lesson. So no, I didn't have to give out dictionaries to all the children because that was not the point. That was not the point of the lesson. He didn't really understand anything about literature or about the particular, the fact that I might know the class better than he did. And he was saying, well, why didn't you give that group, they were clearly very able. They could have looked up the words in the dictionary rather than you tell them the definition, because we were, looking at Lady of Shalott. And I said, because we want to talk about Lady of Shalott. It was not about, and if I'd have given it to that group, you don't know, but I know the rest of the group, the rest of the class would have been, in uproar and distracted. Why have they got the dictionaries and why haven't, and
Yeah.
I just thought, there's that sort of utter blindness to the reality of teaching and the aims of teaching and the craft of what teachers do. I
Does
think,
Ofsted need reforming then?
um, well, I think education as a whole needs serious rethink from first principles. We need
Yeah.
a Department of
Let me put the
Education.
question to you this way, which might focus in a bit better. And that is, I know that you've been critical of certain contemporary education and trends in education, but what do you see as the most pressing problems of school education today? What are the real central issues?
Lack of intellectual and lack of ethical clarity about what education is for.
Is that just about disagreement about what education is for? Because some people might say, and the government might be in this group, that education is really all about training, that it's all about suiting a person to be a good carpenter or a good joiner and to do a good trade.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other people on this kind of Adam Smith side who would say, no, no, education is about educating people for the free time, to be able to enjoy their leisure time and to understand the world and take a fuller part and understanding within it.
Well, that's a really good question, because you're right. There are many different legitimate and valid views of what education is for. And I don't necessarily think there is just one single goal of education. I think it can be multi-layered. It can have many, more than one aim, not many necessarily, but certainly more than one aim. But I think that's just the point. The only way of arriving at some sort of workable consensus is to have a much better debate within the profession, within politics, and within the as wide a public as possible. It needs some, it's like if one party thinks, for example, that vocational training is the most important thing, then what we need is for them to think through and develop the arguments and put them to the public, so that people on the way can then challenge that, and then the public can then see, oh, there is more than one way of, there is more than one goal, and then ultimately it will be up to the, in a democracy, it will be up to the people to decide. But what we have now is that every party, well, not almost every party, sees education almost as a sort of as a given, like there's nothing really to discuss other than how effective it can be according to either Ofsted or PISA or some other kind of metric of empirical measurement, which has its place. I'm not totally against all these things, but unless you understand something more fundamental, I mean, I would argue against the vocational education being the primary goal, because I think that narrows it down too early. I think you choose a vocation at a later point that we need to decide upon. And I would far more promote a cultural and ethical model, if you like, of education.
I mean, these are two fundamentally and philosophically different points of view. The government's view, I think, of education is that a good education is one which enables a higher GDP for the country, that it produces more earning power, and that more earning power is reflected in the budget and the gross domestic product for the country. Whereas the other philosophical viewpoint is that education is for the benefit of the individual, for their greater understanding, knowledge, and to reach their own personal potential.
Mm. Yeah, you're right. There are very different philosophies of education. And I would say that what we have seen over several decades, the secondary level instrumental ideas of education dominate. I mean, so for example, with the model that you've just given, the education as enhancing GDP, I would say to a very limited point, GDP, it's not, to put everything onto education, where you get to the ridiculous point where, you have politicians who have argued in the past that our economy depends on the level of 5-year-olds decoding of phonemes, is to ignore, really important macro level economic things, right? An economy depends on planning, design, what is needed on infrastructure, on investment, the kind and type and quantity of investment. Those things are kind of prior, and education really is secondary to that. I mean, countries did not develop industrially or economically through education. An education system is usually available in a country after they've achieved a certain level of growth. So the growth is prior, and it comes through bigger decisions of government and the public than what goes on in classrooms.
I
So
think that
I would
if I
push that.
understand correctly, there was a big growth in a push for more people to have degrees. When I did my PhD, probably only about 5% of people had degrees in the country a long time ago. But
Mm,
I think Tony Blair was the one who opened up all the floodgates for the number of people going to university. And my understanding is that he took his lead from the fact that um, he discovered that there was a correlation between the number of people who had degrees and the amount of earning power that the country had, the GDP of the country. So, because he thought correlation meant causation, which of
mm,
course it doesn't, he then
yeah,
said, well, what we need to do is just expand the total number of university places. And he got them up to about 45%, I think. And
yeah.
they're
And
up.
I'd say it's been pretty disastrous, actually.
But all
Uh,
because of faulty reasoning and not understanding that correlation doesn't mean causation. You can't improve a country simply by pushing more people through university. Doesn't follow that way.
no, no, I very much agree.
You've spoken about teaching within schools, and how the way in which there's been maybe a retreat from subject content, and the way in which now it's more about the emphasis is on heuristics and learning processes, and less about actually learning facts, knowledge, and content in the curriculum. What's your ideas behind that?
Well, I think there's definitely been much more focus within certainly the subjects that I'm familiar with, which will be the arts and humanities, on transferable skills, which actually don't really mean very much if they're not tied to actual substantive content. There's also been that, if you like, is coming from the people who see education as economic advancement, this idea of transferability, and it goes along with the idea of people can get their portfolio of qualifications and therefore travel all around wherever with this portfolio that's meant to be equally valid in Lisbon as it is in London as anywhere else in the world. So there's that. And then you've also had a political attack, if you like, on canonical knowledge, which I think for me is the most concerning because it particularly affects the humanities, which the sciences in a way have a certain amount of protection because of their applicability in practical things to do with running a society.
I mean,
The
an aeroplane either works so it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly, right. But with the humanities, have always been concerned with, maintaining, if you like, the ethical and kind of cultural depth of thinking within a society. And when you said earlier, the kind of lack of proper thinking. Well, I think we're seeing the results socially of decades of a decline within the humanities, where in political imperatives, certainly in literature, my subject, now outweigh basic questions of, is it a good book? Is this a good poem that we want to, ask our pupils to spend 3 to 4 or 5 weeks learning and getting to grips with? And they can do it. I've taught underachieving Bengali kids, um, bits of Shakespeare, Keats' Ode to Autumn, things that a lot of the kind of conformist orthodoxy in education today would say it's not relevant to these children. They won't be interested in it, or they might be offended by it because it's too British, it's too white. And it's just not true. It's really not true. If you have a teacher that has a kind of love and a knowledge of the subject and the freedom to try out different ways of getting it across to their pupils, they will respond, because if it's good quality content, then by definition it has a more universal appeal than books, for example, that are directly relevant, that speak to a particular problem or demographic within society today.
I'm hoping to speak to Catherine Berbelsing later on in the year, and she's renowned for proving that very point, it seems to me, that you've just made, that she can take some of the most deprived kids and some of the most difficult backgrounds and families and still, teach them and to pass exams and have a great deal of knowledge. Quite remarkable what she's done, I think.
Yeah, I think it's been one of the most damaging misconceptions of the left throughout the modern period, that what was deemed a suitable curriculum for grammar and private schools would not be suitable curriculum content for working class children.
That's called poverty of expectation, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the kernel of truth in it. There's usually a kernel of truth in most things, but it's just kind of quite small. um, is that, if you is that well, there are two things. Is that, if you are from a more middle class background and you have the cultural capital, where you have parents that introduce you to a world of culture spontaneously, then you will find it initially easier at school to do the subjects. But if you're teaching properly, it won't be very long before everybody, whatever their class or cultural background, should be encountering difficulty. Because that's the whole point of education, to expand your thinking, to engage with what you know and take you to a point where you don't know, and encourage you to then sort of move forward and progress and expand your thinking. So at some point, everybody, even if you're like the son of aristocracy, should find, if you're doing education properly. Whether we are or not is another question.
Whether we are or not depends upon a number of factors in school. But I think besides a kind of dumbing down of the curriculum, there's also been a kind of a reinterpretation and a redefining of what teaching is about. I know that in the past if you were studying Macbeth, you'd want to understand the characters and the elements that make the story work and as literature. But now I understand that if you're studying great works of books, you're having to look at it through a different lens. Maybe it's a lens of race. What is the racial component to it? Or what is the cultural, the climate change component within Macbeth? That kind of thing. What's your view on those kind of movements?
I just wish they'd leave Shakespeare alone. If that's what you're going to do with it, just, he'll be all right. Leave him alone. Don't butcher him like this for pupils who have not yet had the pleasure and the deepening experience of just reading canonical work that is so rich and complex in its themes, and characterizations. Before you've introduced children to that, the trend to the orthodoxy today is that you have to teach them the context, right? And then literature is a really good example because they're just incorporating really degraded versions of high theory at school level, right? And it's resulting in stupid things like we're going to look at Macbeth in the frame of toxic masculinity. I mean, this is just, I mean, aside from the fact that Lady Macbeth is quite a powerful figure in her
Yeah.
right, it's a kind of utterly degraded um, initiative. And yet you have, there's Elaine School, I think is how you say it, which is, a kind of £30,000 a year or a term even, I don't know, a private school. And if you look at their website, part of it will be, if you look at their, our offering for sixth form English literature, and you'll look at it and you'll think, oh yeah, it looks pretty standard, pretty normal. They do plays, they do Shakespeare. But and another part, maybe not on the website, or not obviously findable, there's a bit for, the head of English is introducing all this critical theory stuff into literature. So that tells me, okay, so in this school, there are kind of two educational things at play here. There's we don't know exactly, I don't know was this an initiative just of the head of English, or was it the head saying to somebody within the English department, we need to update, we need to modernize, we need to be on board with anti-racism being relevant, etc., anti-racism, and then allocating that task to a staff member who's taken it on board. I mean, I don't know, but these are all the kinds of things that are happening quite often in schools, and it's opening the door to teachers who have a much bigger commitment to using the classroom to pursue their own political agendas
One
rather
of the
than
new,
to their
one of the
subject.
new things which have has now come into schools and is attached to books and movies and in media is trigger warnings. What do you make of those?
Uh, I think they're awful.
I mean, I believe 1984 has just had a trigger warning placed on it.
Yeah, I mean, on one level they're laughable and they're silly, but they are they are kind of sanctioning a culture that encourages everybody to see themselves as so vulnerable that even something they read in a book is likely to harm them. So it's blurring. It's a fueling a kind of snowflakery, a vulnerable sense of personhood, and it is also blurring, encouraging the idea that there's very little difference between words, especially words in a literary text, um, and harm, and actual harm. So I think they're a very bad idea. That is not to say uh, there should be discretion for teachers in their individual situations to, you know, um, by way of introducing a book, to say something like, this will contain language that we don't use today. And, we're going to come across this. But, if I hear you calling somebody in the playground the N word or the P word, that's not on and you will be sanctioned. Yeah, whatever, depending on the particular circumstances. But the idea that as a routine, as a kind of as a mandated or semi-mandated thing, you need to have trigger warnings, and not, you need to have a new layer of people who specializes in, being sensitivity readers and creating a list of trigger warnings, etc., is ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous.
What about the issues now of anti-racism, which seems to become a part of certainly a number of schools in their teaching?
Um, I think that's just a down an outright abdication of responsibility. All right, I think racism is a political problem that should be dealt in the adult sphere amongst citizens. It is not something that you should be addressing directly in schools. there is rather, I think, what schools should be doing, they should be addressing and upholding they should be upholding good conduct universally. You do not insult anybody for whatever reason, right, at schools. And if you do insult somebody and you do use a racial slur, there are a list of sanctions that will be applied to you, if ranging in severity. You don't go straight from, at the minute, we've just got, a sort of childhood, normal kind of, not bullying, but just falling out. And kids are kids. They will say things that they don't fully know the meaning of, right? It's our own son was kind of hauled up for being racist when he'd said something like, oh, you can't join our group because it's not for anybody with afros. For him, the afro hair, when I asked him about it, he said, well, Mrs. Smith has afro hair. Mrs. Smith was a kind of 50-year-old white teacher with a perm. So for him, it simply meant curly hair. He hadn't got the baggage of the meanings that my generation had of that word. And, it's really cruel. What we're seeing now is quite cruel behavior on the part of teachers and schools towards children. And it's not, all that will do is make people hypersensitive and unable to speak freely, unable to hurt and make amends, or hurt and not be friends, or all the range of human interactions which you need to develop as a rounded human being. So, in the attempt to be sort of utopian and create a smooth, dissonance, hurt-free environment for everybody, I think we're really damaging people.
Quite frighteningly. I mean, schools even get the police involved on such matters and have called the police in because someone's called someone a name in the playground.
It's a shocking abdication of responsibility. I mean, if a school does that, they're basically signaling they have no authority. They have absolutely no authority. They would rather call in, the state, the coercive arm of the state, if you like, rather than deal with the problem themselves, and make a judgment.
Isn't there also a problem on the other side with the police themselves, that they would even countenance getting involved in such issues?
Well, I mean, there is. Yes, absolutely, there is. I mean, but that's coming. I think the police are also a social institution, and all our social institutions are under. This is where our latest report on the Equality Act comes in. They have the public sector equality duty has three legs to it, which is you advance equality, you eliminate discrimination, and you foster good relations. Those are impossibly wide goals. Nobody could object to them as sort of stated as they are, but what on earth do they mean? I mean, I doubt many barristers could define exactly what that means. Philosophers over centuries certainly haven't. So I don't see how, Mr. Plod in the police station, or the police as an institution are going. So again, you see there is this, and because the police are particularly in the media spotlight a lot, I think that must add a lot to the pressure for the leadership class to basically acquiesce to the small groups of activists that have been, these little staff groups that have been set up over a decade within every single institution to address the public sector equality duty and issues related to that. So yes, there is a predisposition on the part of the police, but you can, they're acting in a way that is unsurprising given the legal and cultural framework that we have.
We've changed hugely in our in the legal and cultural framework just over the past 10, 20 years or so. And the police have got involved in a whole range of issues which would never be thought possible when I was a child. I mean, there's the policing of speech and almost policing of thought, which is taking place within our society. And I was looking at some of the headlines over the last few weeks. 6 officers arrested a couple for criticizing a councillor online on a WhatsApp group. And 20 officers arrested 6 women in a Quaker meeting house for planning a protest. And an ex-policeman, Julian Fuchs, was put in prison for 6 hours for a tweet and for what the police called having Brexity books, whatever that means. What's happened to society at large and the police in particular then?
Well, I don't know if I've got a single answer to that, but to me it seems that it seems to me that we have become over a few decades accustomed to just not taking our freedom seriously, or to understand what freedom and responsibility means as a citizen in a democracy. I think we've been disenfranchised in a way, not in an overt, explicit way, but gradually through, as more and more decisions and decision making has been taken out of our, sort of put in the hands of expert groups, and seen as a question, things that are actually political and ethical questions, like what kind of education should we have been recast as problems of expert knowledge. So the answer has always been not to discuss and probe, but to set up a little research group to find the evidence and see what the evidence says. That's been a kind of process of almost like psychological disenfranchisement. So we've become very, we've allowed this to happen. I think we as citizens cannot be let off the hook for this. And at the same time, you have got a drive coming from government that comes really, I think, from a sense that they fear us, that they don't really know, ever since we vote, the majority, I say we, I don't presume to know how you voted, but the majority voted for Brexit.
Yes, I've voted for Brexit as well.
That I think that really, really shocked them. That really, really did shock a class of leadership that thought they could have it their way, that thought that things that they knew best, that they were on the right side of history, and that everybody would acquiesce to their to their word and their authority, and not trusting us. If you're in a position of leadership and you don't trust the people whose consent you need to rule, then I think kind of drives more and more authoritarian reactions on their part. So that, rather than, they see something that they may not like or that worries them, like what worries all of us, like the Southport riots last year, and rather than try and look at it anew and think, well, what is happening? What does this actually represent? What are people asking for? Why have they done this? Where have they come from, etc., etc.? They just sort of go to the old script that they know of, oh, far right agitators, boom, more, ramp up the authoritarian legislation, give the police more powers, quicker sentencing, longer sentencing for tweets, and poor old Lucy Connolly is still being, awful.
I was going to ask you what you thought about Lucy Connolly.
It's terrible, absolutely terrible.
31 months for a tweet, which she took down a couple of hours later.
To me, that's like I couldn't believe it. It just seems so arbitrary and so cruel.
It makes you question what kind of country we have become, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what value we place on the old values of free speech and the ability to speak your mind about things.
I think they have to be fought for again. I think they have to be fought for. And I think we need to make the arguments in new ways, because just restating the case as may have worked 20, 30, 40 years ago will work less well today. It won't not work less well, but it will make less sense. So you can't just say freedom of freedom of speech has been a tradition. I mean, you can say it, and people, there's no harm in saying it, but I don't think it will necessarily convince many people at the moment, because we don't, it's also, that is exacerbated by the fact we don't really have a clear difference, I suppose, of politics. It's just like, but our political parties at the moment seem, yes, there's, we've got reform, the kind of, sort of scrappy newcomers on the block, but there's nobody's really able yet to formulate and present in a convincing way, if you like, a project for us as a society to which most people can feel they've got a stake, want to share in. And therefore, yeah, we can give up a little bit of this or give up a bit of our personal interest there, because, we don't mind, because we're in it for the bigger picture, So my generation, for example, the first generation of immigrants to Britain, like my parents, didn't mind that their culture wasn't being celebrated every week in British society, because actually they quite liked a lot of British society and wanted to be part of it. Do you see what I mean? Their people's sense of belonging didn't depend on them having to stake out and affirm and get official validation for their difference, for their differences, for their cultural differences. And that's where multicultural politics has got a huge responsibility, plays a huge part in this.
Yes, I think that this is where your organization, I think, has a very important message, because if I understand it, the very heart of what you're saying is that you should treat everybody exactly the same, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what skin color they are, what their background is, what their religion. Everybody should be treated the same. It's the Martin Luther King doctrine, isn't it? And yet we seem to have lost sight of that, not just in education, but also in society at large, unfortunately.
Yes, I think so. I mean, as you're saying that, I was thinking about that, because I'm not sure that it means treating everybody the same, but it means believing in and agreeing to common standards and values and ways of conducting yourself in public and civic life. Also in private life, but in private life you expect a greater range of freedom. You wouldn't sort of, I wouldn't sit here picking my nose, for example, on a podcast, whereas
Yeah.
I might if I was at home on my own watching telly, that's all. So that's a trivial example, but it kind of rolls up to more, more important ways of how you conduct yourself. So and that means and you do make judgments, which will mean you won't necessarily treat everybody all the same. You should not treat Lucy Connolly the same way as somebody that's been convicted for child abuse, for example. So it means it's got to be balanced with a kind of freedom to make judgments, but with a belief, a shared set of core values, and then ethical principles, and then conduct, which doesn't, as far, well, should, as far as possible, be not legislated, but should be informally accepted and upheld by all of us. I think I think Robert Jenrick's little social media video, I don't know if you saw it, just on
No, I haven't seen that.
well, it was in the context of this discussion on crime and criminality in London, and it was just he went out, he saw some people dodging fares on the underground.
Oh, I did see something of
Yeah,
that.
you did see that. So, I thought, because that was really good. And then I think somebody else made a point, saying, this might seem trivial, like, oh, it's just a fare, like, £2 or whatever. Why make a big fuss of it? But you make a big fuss of it because if you don't uphold those rules, anybody else watching, all the people watching by will know that if anything more serious happens to them, they can't rely on the law. Right. So it's so undermining
and the
and the
mindful
social
fun.
fabric, so
We've come to the end of our time together. I just had one last question for you. It might be the most difficult question of all, but in summary, if I could ask you, your focus has been on education and proper education and improving education. If I could ask you, what one change, what one major change, maybe through legislation or whatever, that you could implement if you had the power to do so, what would you do to make an improvement in education? What would be the first thing?
gosh, that is difficult.
Well, you can have the second thing.
I would want a commitment for education, compulsory education, school age education, that they should be teaching the best knowledge that we have to date, which will be derived from disciplinary knowledge. And schools should be places where good conduct and good dispositions are exemplified. And I'd go back to Aristotle to start a discussion on that.
Yeah.
I think that would be it. I don't know quite how you'd do it, but that's what I would wish for, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.